Laura Stevens never imagined that moving into a modest house near a quiet waterway would become the catalyst for one of the most emotionally draining battles of her adult life. A recently divorced mother of two, she had chosen this place very deliberately. A tucked-away corner of a suburban neighborhood on the edge of town where the houses didn't look identical, where the lawns weren't perfectly clipped to regulation size, and where the only sound she hoped to hear was the breeze pushing through the trees or the occasional splash of water. The property was nothing extravagant, but it had what mattered. A wide backyard that gently sloped down to an old artificial canal, a remnant of a 1960s irrigation project, now more decorative than functional. According to the city records, this portion of the canal was privately maintained by the homeowners whose lots it passed through, and Laura had confirmed that before making the purchase. To her, the small stream was an unexpected gift, something that reminded her children of the joy of being outdoors, away from screens, out in the air with room to shout and laugh and be young without judgment. The first few days after moving in were filled with the sort of chaos that doesn't feel like chaos at all. Boxes stacked in the living room, dishes washed in the bathtub while the kitchen sink was still being hooked up, pizza boxes replacing real, meals and laughter echoing through hallways still smelling faintly of fresh paint. Her son, Tyler, 12 and restless with the awkwardness of puberty, had taken to the yard immediately, while Ava, his 9-year-old sister with a relentless curiosity for insects and anything she could drag home in a bucket, spent most of her time crouching near the canal, building makeshift dams out of sticks and stones. Laura didn't worry. The water barely reached past Ava's ankles, and it moved slowly, calmly, with nowhere to go but around a curve and out of sight toward the neighboring property. There were no fences, no signs, no danger, or so she thought. It was on the 4th day, just as Laura was unpacking the last of her books onto a shelf in the corner of the living room, that she noticed someone standing across the canal on the opposite property line. A narrow plot owned by an elderly woman named Ruth Elgin. The woman was standing still, arms crossed over her chest, lips pinched into a thin line as she watched Tyler and Ava splashing each other with plastic cups. Ruth didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply stared for a long moment, then turned around and disappeared behind the hedge, leaving Laura with a strange knot in her stomach, one she didn't fully understand at the time but would soon become all too familiar with. Later that evening, while she was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, the knot returned. A patrol car slowed to a crawl in front of her house before turning into the driveway and parking with a kind of deliberation that made Laura's pulse quicken. She stood, confused, and approached the officer who stepped out, a man who appeared apologetic before even speaking. He explained that they had received a call reporting unsupervised minors in a contaminated waterway. Laura blinked, stunned, trying to piece together how her children playing in a trickle of suburban runoff could possibly merit police presence. She pointed to the canal, explained its origin, its ownership, the depth, the lack of danger, and the proximity to the house. The officer glanced toward the water, clearly seeing for himself that it was nothing more than a gently flowing stream, barely wide enough for a canoe. He nodded and apologized, admitting that he had suspected as much but was obligated to respond to the report. When Laura asked who had called, he hesitated for a moment, then simply said, "Your neighbor, across the canal." It wasn't the call itself that disturbed Laura. It was the speed with which a benign moment had been transformed into an incident, the escalation of a perfectly ordinary afternoon into a record in a police log. Tyler had stopped laughing after the patrol car left. He didn't want to go back near the water the next day, and Ava asked if the canal was dirty now. Laura reassured them both, but that uneasy feeling remained. She hadn't even met Ruth face to face. There had been no knock on the door, no introduction, no expression of concern. Just a silent judgment turned into formal action. And for someone like Laura, who valued reason, conversation, and the benefit of the doubt, it felt like stepping into a different world, one where things happened in the shadows, where rules were unwritten but ruthlessly enforced by those who had been around long enough to believe they owned them. The next morning, Laura made a point of walking across to Ruth's house. She had no intention of confrontation. In fact, she brought over a small potted plant, a welcome gesture, and rang the doorbell with a smile. Ruth answered the door slowly, her eyes narrowing the moment she saw who was standing there. Laura introduced herself, explained that she was the new neighbor, and mentioned casually that she'd seen the police the previous day. Ruth interrupted her almost immediately, her tone clipped, her words cold and deliberate. "Children shouldn't be playing in the canal. It's not safe. It's not sanitary. and it's a shared resource. That means it's not for personal use. Laura, caught off guard by the sudden hostility, tried to respond calmly. She explained that the canal fell on her property and that the city had confirmed her right to maintain and use the space within her boundary. Ruth's expression didn't change. Just because something is allowed, she said, doesn't mean it's appropriate. You'll learn eventually that this neighborhood has expectations. It was the kind of exchange that seems forgettable on paper, but in practice, it lingered. Ruth hadn't yelled. She hadn't threatened. But there was something unmistakably sharp about her presence, something controlling. Laura walked away that morning with the sense that she had been warned and that every move from now on would be under scrutiny. Sure enough, it began subtly. A city maintenance truck showed up 2 days later, citing an anonymous complaint about an overgrown bush near the canal's edge. Laura was confused. It had been freshly trimmed. Then came a letter from the local water management board requesting a clarification of her property's drainage compliance. Again, it wasn't a direct accusation. It was a nudge, a message. You're being watched and someone doesn't want you here. Still, Laura didn't panic. She responded to the notices, sent emails to confirm the legality of her setup, pulled up the property survey again, and made sure every square inch of the yard was clean, safe, and documented. But her nerves began to fray. Not because anything catastrophic had happened, but because it was all so methodical, so quiet. Ruth never spoke to her again after that morning. She didn't have to. Her actions spoke for her, precise, indirect, and relentless. It was the kind of pressure that didn't break you all at once. It chipped away, little by little, until you began to doubt your own instincts, your memory, even your reality. Laura started to notice how she hesitated before letting the kids go near the canal again. How she glanced toward Ruth's hedge more often than not. How every new envelope in the mailbox gave her a second of anxiety. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew. Something had shifted. What was supposed to be a fresh start, a peaceful place to heal and rebuild, was turning into a quiet battlefield. And she hadn't even picked up a weapon yet. The shift from unease to confrontation came not with a bang, but with the thin, sterile tone of a recorded voicemail. It arrived one late morning, just as Laura was helping Ava with a school assignment about local ecosystems. The message was short and formal, a recorded notification from Child Protective Services, informing her that a welfare check had been initiated based on a community concern. There was no name, no detailed allegation, only a case number and a scheduled time for an in-person visit. Laura froze for a full minute after listening, the phone still clutched in her hand, Ava asking quietly if something was wrong. She smiled automatically, told her daughter everything was fine, then excused herself to the kitchen and replayed the message twice more, each time hoping she'd somehow misunderstood. But the words didn't change. Someone had accused her of endangering her children, and she had no doubt who that someone was. It was the inevitability of it that hit her hardest. The complaints, the police call, the vague city notices, they hadn't just been passive aggression. They had been escalation. Ruth had decided that watching from behind the hedge wasn't enough. Laura wasn't being quietly pushed out, she was being systematically dismantled, one institution at a time. By the time the caseworker arrived, Laura had already assembled every document she thought might be relevant. Birth certificates, vaccination records, letters from Ava's pediatrician, copies of school reports, even photos of the children playing in the backyard with time-stamped metadata. The woman who arrived at her door that afternoon was polite but distant, wearing a badge clipped to her belt and carrying a slim black tablet in one hand. She asked to see where the children slept, requested a walk through the kitchen, and finally sat across from Laura at the dining table to conduct the formal part of the interview. What struck Laura most was how detached the caseworker seemed. Not cruel, not hostile, just procedural. As if this were one of 100 homes she'd enter that week. When Laura asked what the concern had been, the woman glanced at her screen and read from the file. Unsupervised minors in hazardous outdoor conditions, repeated exposure to potential contaminants, and signs of parental negligence. The language was vague but surgical. Laura explained the situation as calmly as she could. She described the canal, the children's activities, the police visit, the subsequent municipal checks. She showed the woman the maintenance reports, the city's own documentation proving that the canal was neither contaminated nor restricted. The woman nodded, typed, nodded again. She didn't seem skeptical. She didn't seem anything. And that, more than anything else, left Laura feeling hollow. Her family's life had been turned into a checklist. After the visit, nothing happened immediately. There was no follow-up call, no second inspection, no charges or reprimands. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the house. Tyler became quieter, more withdrawn, asking Laura in private if someone thought you were a bad mom. Ava, usually so bold, started asking for permission before doing anything in the yard, even digging in the flower beds. Laura tried to reassure them both, but reassurance felt thin when every knock on the door made her tense up. She wasn't angry yet. She was rattled. And when she caught Ruth watching her from the hedge again, hands folded neatly in front of her like a character out of a Gothic novel, Laura simply turned her back and walked inside. Confrontation wouldn't work with someone like Ruth. She was playing a long game, one built on attrition and legal detachment. It was during a trip to the city clerk's office that Laura made her first deliberate countermove. She wasn't there to file a complaint, at least not directly. Instead, she requested copies of all property complaints filed in the last 90 days that mentioned her address, or anything within a 50-foot radius of the canal. It was a slow process, involving multiple departments and some printed records from an aging laser printer. But after nearly 2 hours, she walked away with a stack of pages that included 3 health complaints, 2 sanitation flags, and a noise report, all filed anonymously but with suspiciously identical phrasing. She recognized the pattern instantly. Ruth had a formula, and she was using it. Laura brought the documents to a small law office downtown that specialized in civil mediation. She wasn't ready to sue anyone, not yet, but she wanted to know what her options were. The attorney she met, a woman named Dana Feld, had the precise demeanor Laura needed. Calm, organized, and skeptical of drama. Dana reviewed the paperwork, asked Laura detailed questions about the timeline of events, then leaned back and folded her hands. "You're not the first client I've had who's dealt with a neighbor like this," she said, "but you're one of the few who came in early before this turned into a wildfire." Laura asked what her options were. Dana was honest. Legally, she hasn't crossed the line into criminal harassment. Yet. But you're building a case. Keep records of everything. Document each complaint even if it doesn't lead to action. If she trespasses, photograph it. If she speaks to your children, write down the date, time, and what was said. The goal isn't to fight every blow, it's to show a pattern. Courts don't care about grudges. They care about intent and repetition. Laura left the office with a manila folder and a new sense of purpose. She didn't feel better, but she felt equipped, and that was something. The next morning, she began a journal. Not a diary, not an emotional outpouring, just a daily record. Time, date, event, response. When a new city notice arrived, she photocopied it and logged it. When she saw Ruth peering from the shadows near the edge of her property, she made a note. She didn't respond, didn't escalate. She tracked. Then came the fence. One morning, Laura stepped outside to find a set of metal poles hammered into the narrow strip of land between her yard and the canal. No notice, no explanation. A plastic orange construction mesh ran between the poles, sagging in places but unmistakably intended to divide her property from the water. At first, she assumed it was a city project, some temporary maintenance. But no city crew appeared. No notices were posted. When she called the clerk's office, they had no record of any work scheduled in the area. When she asked her next-door neighbor, an older man named Dennis, who had lived there for nearly 30 years, he shook his head. "Looks like Ruth got tired of watching your kids enjoy themselves," he muttered. Laura stood at the edge of her yard for a long time that afternoon, staring at the makeshift fence. It wasn't sturdy, it wasn't official, but it was a message. A new line had been drawn, one made not of law or reason but of assertion. Ruth wasn't interested in regulations. She was staking a claim, daring Laura to challenge it. And Laura, tired but no longer afraid, picked up the phone, not to call the city, but to call Dana. "We're moving forward," she said. "It's time to make this formal." Dana didn't ask for details. She only said, "Good. Let's talk about your next steps." In the days that followed, Laura began assembling the foundation of what would become her harassment claim. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about anger, though there were moments when the rage boiled so hot it made her hands shake. It was about protection, of her children, of her home, and of the peace she had come here to rebuild. Ruth had underestimated her, mistaking quiet for weakness. But Laura had learned something crucial in these past few weeks. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's meticulous. Sometimes it's strategic. And sometimes it starts with a single step in the right direction, followed by another and another, until even the most relentless opponent begins to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. There are certain thresholds in life that, once crossed, quietly rearrange everything you thought you understood about the people around you. Laura didn't recognize the exact moment when Ruth stopped being merely an intrusive neighbor and became an active threat, but it revealed itself in pieces, small, unsettling changes that accumulated until they formed something undeniable. The first came 2 weeks after the makeshift fence appeared. Laura had filed a formal inquiry with the city, and the response was as predictable as it was frustrating. No official barriers had been authorized, and no claims had been filed to redefine the use of the canal or its bordering grounds. The city technician who came to verify the property line shook his head and scribbled a few notes. "This is yours," he confirmed. "What she's doing, well, it's not legal, but unless she installs concrete posts or claims structural rights, we can't do much." It was the same tune Laura had begun hearing from multiple agencies. Acknowledgement without intervention, sympathy without consequence. So the fence remained, and then came the notices. At first, Laura dismissed them as clerical errors. A letter from the county inspector, citing unregulated landscape alterations, arrived in the mail, followed 2 days later by a warning about potential water runoff violations due to non-permitted backyard modifications. She spent hours sifting through city codes and regulations, then longer still writing formal replies, attaching photographs, referencing property maps, and demanding clarification. One by one, the notices faded away, deemed either unsubstantiated or misfiled. But it wasn't the bureaucracy that unnerved her. It was the intent behind it. Someone was actively manufacturing problems, reporting fictitious violations with language precise enough to trigger administrative response. Laura no longer had any doubts. Ruth was waging a slow, calculated campaign, knowing full well that each incident, even if dismissed, would chip away at Laura's stability, her time, her sense of security. Then it became physical. It began subtly, almost comically. Laura's garbage bins, which she always placed carefully by the curb on collection days, started being found tipped over in the morning, contents spilled out across the lawn, lids missing. At first, she blamed raccoons or wind, but when it happened 3 weeks in a row, always on Sunday nights, always within the same 2-hour window after sundown, she knew better. She set an alarm hoping to catch whoever was responsible, but each time she looked outside, the street remained still. No movement, no sound. Whoever was doing it knew her routines. They weren't just disruptive, they were calculated. The next sign was more deliberate. One morning, Tyler found his bike in the front yard with the tires slashed. No theft attempt, no missing parts, just a quiet act of damage that served no purpose except to send a message. Ava, already wary of playing near the canal, asked if they could keep the curtains drawn on the weekends. "So she doesn't watch us." Laura told her not to worry, trying to mask the tightening in her chest, but she knew the boundaries had shifted. Ruth wasn't merely reporting and complaining, she was encroaching, slowly, methodically, dangerously. Laura returned to Dana's office, this time with a folder filled to bursting. She placed it on the desk without a word. Dana opened it, leafed through the documents, photos, and city replies, then looked up with the steady composure Laura had come to appreciate. "She's escalating," Dana said simply, "and that means we can too." They began by filing a formal cease and desist letter, served directly to Ruth's address. The letter, drafted with meticulous legal precision, outlined the incidents to date, cited the relevant state statutes regarding harassment, and made it clear that continued behavior would result in civil action. It was not a threat. It was a line in the sand. Ruth didn't respond. Not with a letter, not with a lawyer, not even with a comment. But the following weekend, Laura woke to find a bag of dead fish dumped across the path to the canal, their rotting bodies spreading a foul stench through the yard. It was so absurd, so grotesque, that for a moment she could only stare. But Tyler, who had gone out first and discovered the mess, said what they were all thinking. "She wants us to stop using the water." Laura filed a police report. The responding officer, different from the first one weeks ago, took her statement seriously but admitted their hands were tied. "Unless you catch her in the act," he said, "or we have video, it's hard to make anything stick." But keep documenting. It helps your case. So Laura documented. She bought a second outdoor camera, more discreet than the one mounted by the door, and installed it at the edge of the patio, angled just enough to catch the slope toward the canal and the corner of Ruth's yard. It wasn't about spying. It was insurance. And she hated needing it. Still, the pressure mounted. The following Tuesday, Ava came inside crying, clutching her hand where she'd been pricked by something near the fence. Laura examined the wound, superficial but inflamed, and went outside to investigate. Hidden beneath the grass near one of the fence poles was a small, rusted wire hook, intentionally shaped and placed. Laura found two more nearby. Whether it was designed to injure or to intimidate didn't matter. Someone had deliberately introduced hazards into the area where her children played. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, though it gnawed at her, but because of fury. She paced the hallway, stepping carefully over creaky boards, listening for sounds that never came. Ruth's house remained dark, quiet, impassive, but it loomed, and Laura felt its presence like a pressure in her lungs. It was Tyler, quietly but decisively, who pushed Laura to take the next step. One evening, after dinner, he asked if they were going to move again. Laura was startled. "Why would we move?" she asked. Tyler hesitated. "Because I think that's what she wants. And I don't want to give her what she wants." That sentence lingered with Laura for days. Her son, barely old enough to understand the mechanics of property law, grasped something deeper. That standing your ground wasn't about stubbornness, it was about principle. It was about refusing to let someone rewrite the rules of your life out of spite. With Dana's help, Laura began building her formal harassment claim. They collected city records, medical notes, repair bills, neighborhood testimonies, anything that demonstrated not just isolated incidents but a sustained pattern of targeted aggression. They obtained a report from a pediatrician verifying Ava's anxiety symptoms. They compiled every service ticket, every misfiled notice, and every email thread Laura had pursued. Together, they began constructing a narrative that no longer depended on sympathy, but on fact. Ruth, for all her silence, had left a paper trail, and Laura was going to use it. And then, just as the case was solidifying, came the final provocation that made any further doubts impossible. One morning, Laura discovered a folded envelope wedged into her storm door, handwritten in precise, angular script. "You may think you're safe here, but this water doesn't belong to you. Some places remember who they're meant for. Some people don't." There was no name, no return address, no direct threat, but it sent a shiver through Laura's spine that no bureaucratic letter ever had. It was personal. It was intentional. It was the voice of someone who no longer cared about subtlety. Laura handed the envelope to Dana that afternoon. Dana read it carefully, then said, "We file next week." Laura nodded. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Something had clicked inside her. A realization that what she was defending wasn't just a patch of land or the right to enjoy a backyard. It was her place in the world, her right to live without fear, her children's right to grow up without learning to shrink themselves in the face of cruelty. Ruth had made a mistake. She had assumed that silence meant surrender, but Laura wasn't retreating. She was preparing. And when the next move came, she would be ready. Not just to endure it, but to answer it with everything the law allowed. The legal machinery had begun to turn, slow but steady, like a gear system shaking off dust. Laura had always thought of the law as something static, something you referenced, not something you wielded. But now, with Dana handling the harassment complaint and every move methodically documented, she found herself navigating a new language, one of filings, exhibits, procedural response windows, and municipal codes. It was not glamorous. It was not dramatic. But it was solid ground, and after weeks of walking a psychological tightrope under Ruth's constant shadow, solid ground felt like a luxury. The official filing had been submitted with care, naming specific instances, including the letter, the fish incident, the false complaints, and the makeshift fencing, all supported by documentation and witness statements from those few neighbors. Brave, or perhaps simply annoyed, enough to acknowledge what they had seen. There were no lofty accusations, no emotional appeals. It was clean, precise, and undeniable in its pattern. Dana assured her that the very presence of the claim would force Ruth to respond, legally and formally within a fixed period. There would be no more passive silence from across the hedge. Ruth would have to come out from behind her veil of plausible deniability. And that's when the unexpected happened. Not an attack, not a final escalation, but a shift. Subtle and strategic, as if Ruth had sensed the change in current and adjusted her sails accordingly. The complaints stopped. The fence remained, but there were no new notes, no tipped trash cans, no mystery damages or city inspections. Ruth, for all intents and purposes, vanished from view. Her curtain stayed drawn, her yard went quiet. The shadow remained, but it grew still. At first, Laura was wary, sure it was only a pause before another strike. But after a week, then two, she realized that the battle had, at least temporarily, moved to the courtroom. The summons came quietly, an official envelope on cream paper stating that Ruth had retained counsel and would be challenging Laura's harassment claim. But that wasn't the surprise. The surprise was the counter-assertion filed alongside it. Ruth was now alleging that Laura's children had repeatedly trespassed onto her property, causing disturbances, verbal altercations, and in one instance, destruction of ornamental landscaping. It was absurd. Ava couldn't tell an ornamental plant from a weed, and Tyler had barely stepped out of their yard since the incident with the slashed bike tires. But the claim was filed, and Laura's first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by a flush of anger so sudden she had to steady herself at the kitchen counter. Dana's reaction was calmer. "This is a common tactic," she explained. "When they feel a corner closing in, they throw up dust to blur the lines. It doesn't have to hold up in court, it just has to make you second-guess your footing. But you've documented everything. We stick to that. Let her explain why she suddenly feels victimized after months of provable silence." Still, it stung. Not just the lie, but the way it attempted to flip the narrative, to cast Laura and her children as the aggressors in their own story. Tyler, upon hearing about the counterclaim, looked down at his hands and said, "Is she saying we're the bad guys now?" Laura didn't know how to answer that without giving in to the frustration bubbling under her skin. She told him the truth, that some people use lies when they can't defend their actions with facts, and promised him that the court would see through it. She said it with conviction, but in private, she worried. Not because she feared the outcome, but because she hated what it was doing to her kids. The waterway that had once been a symbol of peace had become a boundary line in a Cold War, and every day they spent confined indoors looking out with hesitation felt like a small loss. The mediation was scheduled 2 weeks later at a neutral facility in the next town over. Laura arrived early, accompanied by Dana, both women dressed professionally but simply, exuding calm, collected readiness. The mediator, a retired judge with a kind but unreadable expression, greeted them with quiet civility before leading them to a long conference table lined with dull plastic chairs. Laura sat at one end, Dana beside her, and waited. Ruth entered exactly on time, accompanied by a man in an ill-fitting suit and a face fixed in bureaucratic detachment. Ruth, by contrast, looked sharp, not in a glamorous way, but in a manner sharpened by intention. Every detail calculated. She did not look at Laura. She sat stiffly, folded her hands, and waited for the session to begin. The mediation opened with the expected formalities. The mediator explained the goals of the session, the confidentiality agreement, the importance of respectful conduct, and then allowed each side to speak. Donna went first, summarizing the complaint with calm clarity, presenting key documentation. Photos, dates, logs, medical records, all laid out in an orderly progression. She spoke not of emotions, but of events, of fact, of the visible line that ran through every page unbroken. Then it was Ruth's turn. Her attorney began with a passive defense. That Ruth had simply been concerned about the safety of the neighborhood, that her actions were misinterpreted, that she had no animosity toward the Stevens family. Then, in a shift that surprised even her own lawyer, Ruth spoke directly. She claimed that the canal had long been treated as a shared environmental resource, that prior neighbors had agreed, though not in writing, that it would not be used for recreational purposes. She said the sounds of laughter and splashing had triggered memories of past traumas, that she had acted not out of malice but from emotional necessity. It was a performance measured and contrived, but not entirely lacking in credibility. Ruth wasn't pleading, she was reframing the narrative. Dana responded with calm force. "Intentions are not what's on trial. Actions are. What matters here is not whether Miss Elgin felt discomfort, but what she did in response to it: harassment, misrepresentation, dangerous interference, and escalation that impacted the health and well-being of two minors. The mediator took notes throughout, asking occasional clarifying questions but offering no opinions. By the end of the session, there was no resolution. Ruth declined to settle. The case would proceed to court. As Laura walked out of the building and into the chilled afternoon air, she felt both drained and strangely clear-headed. The performance, the maneuvering, the deflections, they weren't surprising. They were tactics. And Ruth had just revealed hers. For all the talk of peace and misunderstanding, Ruth had made it clear she would rather fight than admit fault. That meant Laura's next steps would require more than defense. They would require strategy. That night, Laura sat by the window overlooking the canal, watching the water move in slow, endless ripples. It had not changed, despite everything that had happened. It still cut quietly through the earth, a thread of continuity in a fractured landscape. But now it meant something different. It wasn't just water. It was the line she had chosen to hold. And no matter what came next, she wasn't stepping back. The silence that followed the failed mediation was not a truce. It was an inhaled breath before the storm. Laura had hoped in some quiet, optimistic corner of her mind that Ruth might pull back, might retreat in the face of looming legal consequences and the weight of documented evidence. But what came next made it clear that Ruth had no intention of de-escalating. Instead, she chose a different approach, less confrontational on the surface, but even more invasive in its reach and intent. She began to weaponize the community. It started with the neighborhood newsletter, a small folded sheet that appeared every month in mailboxes, mostly filled with benign announcements about bake sales, street repairs, and local events. This time, however, Laura noticed a subtle but pointed shift in tone. There was a new column titled Community Standards and Mutual Respect, authored anonymously, filled with vague warnings about changes in behavioral norms and the importance of preserving neighborhood harmony. It mentioned no names, but referenced families misusing shared water infrastructure and creating auditory disturbances that disrupt residential peace. It was Ruth's voice, barely veiled, and it landed like a coded signal to every neighbor still on the fence about which side to take. A few days later, Laura's kids were walking home from school when they were stopped by a woman 2 houses down who told Ava that not everyone wants to hear screaming all afternoon, and suggested they find somewhere more appropriate to play. Tyler said nothing until they got home, but when Laura asked how the walk went, his face told her everything. She went to Dana that same afternoon, frustrated, shaking, not out of fear but rage. She's pulling the neighbors into it now. She's poisoning the well. Dana, as always, listened with careful calm, then leaned forward. We can't control what people say behind hedges and closed doors. But if anyone makes a direct statement to your children again, we file. No warnings, no mediation. We escalate just like she does, but with law. Laura nodded, her jaw tight. She was tired of being reasonable, tired of trying to explain, tired of assuming people would eventually come around to the truth. She wasn't chasing anyone's approval anymore. If the neighborhood wanted to pick sides, they could, but they'd have to own the consequences. The next strike came not through whisper campaigns or sideways comments, but with terrifying directness. One Saturday afternoon, as Laura was folding laundry and listening to the muffled sound of the kids laughing in the backyard, she heard a noise. Sharp, high-pitched, a metallic crack, followed by a yelp. She ran outside, heart pounding, to find Ava on the ground by the canal, holding her knee and crying. Tyler was crouched beside her, pale and wide-eyed. She stepped on something, he said, and pointed to a patch of disturbed earth just beside the fence. Laura dropped to her knees and gently examined Ava's leg. The skin was torn. Not deeply, but enough to bleed steadily, and when she looked closer, she saw the culprit. A bent metal staple protruding from the ground, thick and rusted, half buried but clearly placed there. She didn't speak. She picked Ava up, carried her inside, cleaned the wound with trembling hands, and then drove straight to urgent care. The doctor said it wasn't deep, but he was concerned about tetanus exposure. Ava received a booster shot, and Laura left with medical records in hand and a fury that burned with terrifying clarity. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she drove to the police station, walked up to the front desk, and calmly asked to speak with the officer on duty. She presented the report, the photos she had taken, the records from urgent care, and then added, "This was not an accident. This was a trap. My daughter could have been seriously injured." The officer, a young man with clear discomfort flickering across his face, reviewed the evidence and nodded slowly. "We can open an investigation," he said, "but unless we have video or a witness." "I have cameras," Laura interrupted, "and I'm pulling the footage tonight." She went straight home and reviewed every second of the past 24 hours. At first, she found nothing. The camera by the patio had a blind spot near the canal, and the movement sensor hadn't triggered in that area. But then, at around 3:12 a.m., the night before, the corner camera picked up a shadow. Barely visible, a slow movement near the fence line, someone crouching, shifting the dirt. The resolution wasn't perfect, and the face wasn't visible, but the figure's shape, posture, and gait were unmistakable. Laura paused the video, zoomed in, and stared. She didn't need to see the face. It was Ruth. Dana submitted the footage with a supplemental complaint the next morning, citing endangerment of a minor, trespassing, and malicious tampering with property. The escalation had moved into criminal territory now, and while the police were still cautious, still slow, they took the complaint seriously enough to open a formal file. A detective was assigned, Ruth was contacted, and for the first time she was forced to answer under pressure. Still, she didn't stop, just changed her methods again. Within the week, a notice arrived from the Water Management Department, an official-looking letter alleging unauthorized use of natural water sources for recreational purposes, citing municipal code sections that were vague and likely outdated. Laura called the department and, after being transferred 3 times, finally spoke to a clerk who admitted the complaint had come from a resident but refused to name them. "It's part of the process," he said. "We have to follow up." Laura knew the process now. She submitted her rebuttal with copies of the property line, maintenance agreements, and water quality assessments. Dana added the complaint to the harassment file, but it wasn't about the paperwork anymore. It was about wearing her down. And then came the breaking point, one she hadn't expected. One night, around 11:30 p.m., Laura heard something. Not outside. Inside. A knock, not on the front door, but on the back one. The door that opened onto the patio facing the canal. It wasn't loud, just deliberate. 3 soft taps. She froze, listening, waiting, her heart hammering in her throat. Then another 3. She grabbed her phone and called the police, whispering her address, telling them she believed someone was outside her house. She turned on the backyard lights remotely from her phone. Nothing. By the time officers arrived, whoever it was had vanished. But the next morning, a handprint was visible on the glass. Small, gloved. Still smudged against the clean pane like a signature. Laura didn't speak to the kids about it. She didn't want them to feel unsafe in their own home, though the idea of safety now felt increasingly theoretical. But she gave the footage to the police and made sure it was added to the case file. Dana called her that afternoon and said, "It's time. We file for the restraining order, and we file the civil suit." Laura agreed. She had given Ruth every opportunity to stop, to pull back, to retreat with some semblance of grace. But this late-night presence, this invasion of private space, it was more than escalation. It was psychological warfare, and she was done being the passive party. That night, as she locked every door and double-checked each camera feed, Laura sat at the dining table and stared at the growing stack of legal documents in front of her. It looked like a case file, but to her it was something more. It was a map, a trail of proof that she had done everything the right way, every step of the way, that she hadn't retaliated with vandalism or confrontation or fear, but with truth. Ruth had tried to isolate her, then intimidate her, then bury her in bureaucracy, but she had failed. Laura knew the final stages of this were going to be ugly. Public hearings, depositions, maybe even testimony. But she was no longer intimidated by the idea. She wasn't just defending her family anymore. She was defending the principle that people, especially women, especially mothers, deserve to live without being stalked, gaslit, and pushed to the brink by neighbors with too much time and too little conscience. Ruth had underestimated her resolve. And now, Laura would show her what it looked like when resolve turned into action. The court date loomed like a storm system Laura could feel in her bones. It had been scheduled for weeks, but the closer it drew, the more palpable its weight became. Not just in her own life, but in the subtle shift of the entire neighborhood Neighbors who once gave her a tight-lipped nod now avoided eye contact. Some looked out through half-closed blinds when she walked by, their curiosity and discomfort mingling in silence. Ruth, on the other hand, remained unchanged, at least outwardly. She continued her routines as if untouched by the growing weight of her actions, gliding in and out of her house with the calm grace of someone who believed they were above consequence. And maybe she did. Maybe that was what made her dangerous to begin with. Not the overt acts, but the quiet belief that she could twist the rules in her favor, always remaining one step removed from direct accountability. But this time, Laura was ready. With Dana's help, she had spent weeks assembling a file that read like a roadmap of calculated psychological assault. Dates, statements, witness accounts, photos, medical documentation, video footage, city correspondence, and signed affidavits. Ruth's behavior had evolved from neighborhood gossip to institutional abuse, and the evidence laid it out in stark chronological detail. There would be no room for ambiguity, no benefit of the doubt left to exploit. Still, Laura was under no illusion that the courtroom would be easy. These kinds of civil harassment cases often depended not just on proof, but on how the judge perceived intent, on whether the victim could remain composed under pressure, and the defendant could maintain the illusion of respectability. It was less a battle of facts than a battle of credibility. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and brittle. Laura arrived early, dressed plainly, her documents neatly organized, her breathing steady. Dana met her in the lobby of the courthouse, greeted her with a quiet nod and a reassuring hand on the shoulder, then led her toward the assigned courtroom. Ruth was already there, seated with her lawyer, an older man with a practiced indifference in his posture, the kind of legal presence that made its living off downplaying serious harm through technical language. Ruth herself wore a pale blouse and an expression of serene irritation, as though she were attending an inconvenient community meeting rather than facing formal allegations of targeted harassment. She did not look at Laura. She didn't need to. The message was still the same. I don't regret a thing. The hearing began with procedural formality. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, laid out the structure of the proceedings and invited each party to deliver opening statements. Ruth's attorney went first, stating that his client had been deeply unsettled by changes in neighborhood dynamics and had, in her words, acted out of concern, not hostility. He painted a picture of a woman trying to maintain order, suddenly overwhelmed by noise, perceived risk and unfamiliar behavior, and who had resorted to official channels in an attempt to restore peace. The word harassment, he argued, was being misapplied to a situation that amounted to no more than miscommunication and incompatible lifestyles. Then Dana stood and, with a quiet precision that made Laura's chest tighten, began to dismantle that narrative piece by piece. She did not appeal to emotion. She laid out the facts, the anonymous complaints filed in sequence, the timing of city interventions, the hand-delivered notes, the physical hazards found in the yard, the medical impact on Ava, and the video of Ruth trespassing near the canal under cover of night. Each point was backed by dates, records, and documents. There was no speculation. There was only what could be proven. Then came the testimonies. Laura spoke first. She described the timeline with clarity, her voice steady even as her hands gripped the edge of the table in front of her. She talked about the first 911 call, the fence, the fish, the metal traps in the yard, the night knocks, and the slow, suffocating pressure of living under constant surveillance and interference. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She let the facts speak. The judge listened without interrupting, jotting notes occasionally, her face unreadable but attentive. Ruth's attorney objected to portions of the timeline, claiming exaggeration and hearsay, but the judge allowed it, noting the volume and consistency of supporting evidence. When Ruth was finally called to testify, she maintained a calm demeanor, denying any malicious intent and framing her actions as the natural response of a concerned neighbor watching a single mother struggle to manage two unruly children. "I did what I thought was necessary to protect our community," she said. "I didn't want to involve the authorities, but there were patterns of behavior that made me feel deeply uncomfortable." Dana's cross-examination was surgical. "You filed over 24 complaints in 3 months. Not one of them resulted in action from a city agency. Can you explain that?" Ruth faltered slightly. "Well, I thought—" Dana continued, "Can you explain why you installed a fence without a permit?" Ruth tried to clarify. It wasn't a fence, it was just a barrier. A barrier with steel posts and warning tape, Dana clarified, placed exactly along your property line after formal notice was given regarding a dispute. Ruth's answers grew thinner, more rehearsed. And then came the footage. Dana submitted the video showing Ruth trespassing near the canal late at night, placing what would later be identified as the metal spike Ava stepped on. The room went still. Ruth's attorney objected, claiming the footage was inconclusive, but the judge leaned forward and asked Laura directly, "Is this your surveillance equipment? Are these your property boundaries?" When Laura confirmed, the judge asked Dana to proceed. The rest of the footage, short, grainy, but undeniable, spoke for itself. The hearing ended with closing statements, both sides repeating their positions, but the air in the courtroom had shifted. Ruth looked less composed now, her eyes flicking nervously as the judge summarized the key points and said that she would deliver a ruling by the following week. But that ruling never came. 3 days later, the court sent a notice. The judge had issued an early decision. Laura received it in a sealed envelope, hands trembling as she opened it at the kitchen table. The language was formal, dry, procedural, but the meaning was unmistakable. The court found in her favor. A permanent restraining order was granted against Ruth Elgin, prohibiting her from approaching Laura or her children within a specified distance, from initiating any form of contact, and from submitting complaints or reports concerning Laura's property to any city agency unless through legal counsel. Additionally, the court had referred the case to a county-level review board to evaluate whether Ruth's conduct qualified for further civil penalties. Laura sat for a long time, the paper trembling in her hands. Not from fear, not from relief, from something quieter and heavier, the full weight of survival. It was over, not in the dramatic sense of vindication, but in the slow, grinding recognition that she had stood her ground, that she had refused to be erased from her own life by someone else's bitterness. There were still things to heal. Ava still didn't want to go near the canal, and Tyler still jumped at the sound of the back door creaking in the wind. But the shadow was gone. The pressure was gone. Ruth could no longer reach them, and that meant for the first time in months they could begin to live again. The days that followed the court ruling were marked not by celebration but by stillness. A kind of emotional decompression that Laura hadn't realized she needed until it arrived. There was no immediate joy, no giddy rush of victory, just the quiet absence of fear. No more waiting for letters, no knocks on the door after dark, no whispers carried across the yard. Ruth's presence, once a constant pressure pressing in from across the canal, had dissipated like mist in the morning sun. Laura could finally exhale, but she did so carefully, slowly, with the awareness that healing didn't come just because a piece of paper said it could. It came with time, with trust rebuilt brick by brick, and with the choice to step back into the places she had learned to avoid. The restraining order had teeth. Ruth could no longer send reports, approach the property, or even communicate with city offices about Laura without going through legal channels. But more than the legal boundaries, it was the clarity of consequence that finally reshaped the balance of power. Ruth no longer walked past Laura's driveway. She no longer gardened near the hedge or left her trash bins conspicuously close to the property line. In fact, she rarely left the house at all. It was unclear whether shame or stubbornness kept her secluded, but the result was the same: silence. And for once, it was welcome. Word traveled, as it always does. Though Laura hadn't spoken about the hearing to anyone but Dana and the court, neighbors seemed to know. Some still kept their distance, wary or embarrassed by their earlier neutrality, but a few began to reappear with cautious kindness. Dennis, the elderly man 2 doors down who had once told her to ignore Ruth's provocations, stopped by one afternoon with a basket of tomatoes from his garden and said, "Good on you. Someone had to draw the line." Another neighbor, a woman with twin boys who had once pulled them indoors every time Ava and Tyler went outside, nodded to Laura one morning and offered a quiet, "If you ever need anything, just knock." Laura didn't need validation, but those small gestures mattered more than she expected. Not because they made her feel liked, but because they reminded her that Ruth had not spoken for everyone. That silence did not mean consensus. That standing alone hadn't meant being alone. The neighborhood was still what it had always been, a patchwork of people with different fears, boundaries, and lives. But now it felt just a little more honest. The children took longer to come back to themselves. Ava was the first to test the water again. cautiously dipping her toes into the canal from the stone edge while Laura watched from the porch. It wasn't a dramatic return, just a quiet moment of curiosity, of testing whether the space still belonged to her. Tyler took longer. He was older, more aware of the weight that had been pressing down on their family, and slower to trust that it had really lifted. But one afternoon, Laura found him sitting on the slope near the water, earbuds in, sketch pad on his knees, drawing. He didn't say anything when she approached, he just handed her the pad. It was a picture of the house, the canal, and 3 small figures standing in the yard. "We're not leaving, right?" he asked. Laura shook her head and sat beside him. In the weeks that followed, they reclaimed their space not with grand gestures, but with simple routines. Meals outside, books read in the hammock, weekend games in the yard. The canal became a backdrop again, not a border. Laura tended the garden, planted sunflowers along the fence, and replaced the dead grass near the path with creeping thyme. She didn't do it to erase the past, but to mark the return of normalcy, of intention, of living without intrusion. She even installed new solar lights along the walkway, not for security, but for warmth. A small reminder that this was her home, and she had every right to make it hers without apology. Dana remained in touch, guiding Laura through the final administrative steps. Closing the case, updating property documents to reflect the court decision, and setting up a file in case Ruth ever violated the order. But aside from one brief attempt by Ruth's attorney to contest the restriction's duration, which the court denied, there was no more movement. The battle was done. On a late summer evening, Laura hosted a small gathering. Nothing official or extravagant, just a backyard dinner with a few neighbors. The kids chasing fireflies while the adults talked over grilled vegetables and cold drinks. It wasn't a celebration, it was a restoration. No speeches were made, no stories shared about what had happened. And yet, the very act of gathering, of laughing again without the fear of being watched or judged, was its own quiet triumph. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Laura stood at the edge of the canal, barefoot in the grass, looking out across the water that had once been a battleground and was now, once again, just water. She didn't feel victorious. She felt steady, solid, whole. The kind of peace that comes not from avoiding conflict, but from surviving it with your values intact. From knowing you were right, not because a judge agreed, but because you never gave up your dignity for the sake of comfort. As the breeze stirred the trees and the lights flickered gently across the yard, Laura thought about how close she had come to shrinking, to retreating, to letting someone else's bitterness dictate the shape of her life. But she hadn't. She had chosen to stand, not out of pride, but out of necessity. And now, with the worst behind her, she could finally look forward. Not with fear, but with quiet, grounded confidence. The kind that doesn't need to be declared out loud. The kind that simply is.